Welcome to the Deep Dive. We cut through the dense research and complicated financial reports so you can understand what's really happening beneath the headlines. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the UK's financial future, cracking open the crucial July 2025 Fiscal Risks and Sustainability Report from the Office for Budget Responsibility. And we're going to focus on three critical long-term risks that are really threatening the foundation of the UK state. The thing is, we're starting from a pretty tough position. I mean, when the OBR drafted this report, UK government debt was already at 94% of GDP.
Which is incredibly high. That puts the UK at sixth highest among all advanced economies.
Exactly. And it's not just the size of the debt, right? It's the cost of servicing it that's compounding the problem.
That's the real kicker.
We're seeing a 10-year bond yield of 4.5%. That's the third highest cost of borrowing among advanced economies. We're essentially paying a premium just to keep the lights on.
And that high cost of borrowing, that's the critical context for our whole conversation today. It means the structural threats we're about to discuss aren't, some abstract far-off problem. They are financially compounding in real time. So the mission for you today is to grasp the sheer scale of the three accelerating risks that the FRS report really dives into. First, the long-term strain on the pension system. Second, the sharp volatility exposed by the new, broader public sector balance sheet measure. The public sector net financial liabilities, or PSNFL. And third, the mounting fiscal costs of climate change, which, and this is key, are now being modeled as much, much higher than we previously understood.
Okay, let's start with that first major threat, pensions. This is where demographics and, I think, policy risk really collide.
They absolutely do.
The state pension is already the second largest expense for the government. It's sitting at about 5% of GDP.
And what's also crucial is its historical relationship with government debt, pension funds, insurance companies. For a long time, they've been the foundational domestic holders of UK government debt.
Holding about a third of all gilts, right?
Roughly a third, yeah. And that position, both as a huge cost center and as a reliable buyer of our debt, is coming under some serious sustained pressure. We can really identify two core sources for the long-term fiscal rise, which is forecast to push state pension spending up from that 5% of GDP today.
Up to
7.7% of GDP by the early 2070s.
Wow.
The first source is, well, it's pretty straightforward demographics. The ratio of the working age population supporting each pensioner.
The dependency ratio.
Exactly, the dependency ratio. It's expected to fall from 3.4 back in the 1970s to just 2.7 by the early 2070s. That reduction in the labor force, just that alone, accounts for 1.6 percentage points of that projected spending increase.
So that's the slow-moving but unavoidable trend. But what's fascinating and frankly quite volatile is the role of policy risk, and specifically the triple lock. We just keep seeing these staggering cost overruns.
Absolutely. The volatility is the key word there. When the triple lock, which, guarantees the state pension rises by the highest of inflation earnings, or 2.5% when it was introduced, the OBR projected pretty modest costs.
I remember that. They thought it would be manageable.
They did. They estimated it would only cost about £5.2 billion annually by the end of this decade, compared to just linking it to average earnings. But then, because of the massive, completely unexpected inflation and earnings volatility we saw after the pandemic,
Right.
the triple lock mechanism kicked in hard. It has already cost around 3 times more than those initial expectations. It's now forecast to cost $15.5 billion annually by 2029-30.
Can you just elaborate on why the design makes it so volatile? Is it about the lag between the measurement periods and when the payment actually happens?
Precisely. The policy basically bakes in a spike whenever there's a short-term economic shock, like that sudden surge in earnings when the economy reopened post-lockdown. So if this kind of short-term volatility persists, which, is a huge risk in a world of geopolitical and climate shocks, the OBR warns that state pension spending could be another 1.5% of GDP higher by the early 2070s, even on top of their central projection.
So we have rising costs in the public system, but there's also this huge social risk brewing in the private sector. The report highlights that something like 40% of working-age people are on track to fall short of their target replacement rate for retirement income.
And that shortage is just an indirect fiscal cost waiting to happen. It creates future pressure, especially because two high-risk groups for undersaving are growing really rapidly. First, private renters among pensioners. That group is projected to rise sharply from about 6% today to 17% by the 2040s. These people don't have home equity as a buffer, so the government will likely have to step in.
So more housing benefit spending.
Potentially an extra £2 billion annually. And second, the self-employed. Fewer than 1 in 5 are enrolled in a private pension scheme.
That's a shocking statistic.
It is. And the OBR projects, about 3/5 of this growing group, are said to miss not just the aspirational target rate, but even the minimum living standards benchmark. That points to a huge social intervention cost down the line.
Okay, so that's the demand side. Now let's circle back to the supply side for government debt. The structural risk we've talked about for years. The shift from defined benefit or DB schemes to defined contribution, DC schemes, that's now hitting the gilt market hard.
Right. And just to quickly recap for everyone, DB schemes have to match their long-term liabilities, so they hold over half, a whopping 52% of their assets in gilts.
Whereas DC schemes, which are now the default for most of us, hold just 7%. We're literally watching the slow dismantling of the UK's traditional domestic funding mechanism.
That's the key synthesis. If you connect this to the bigger picture, the resulting fall in demand for long-term government debt is dramatic. Pension sector gilt holdings are forecast to fall from 29.5% of GDP today to just 10.9% by the early 2070s. This huge drain on reliable domestic demand forces the government to rely more and more on external, often more volatile, investors.
And that has a direct impact on borrowing costs.
A huge impact.
Yeah.
The OBR estimates this could push up government borrowing costs, the long-term interest rates, by around 0.8 percentage points.
And with debt near 100% of GDP.
It translates to an eventual increase of $22 billion in annual debt interest spending. To put that figure in perspective for you, that is roughly the entire annual budget for the Department for Transport.
Or the entire budget for Scotland.
Exactly. That's the compounding financial cost of this one structural shift.
That structural threat to the debt market leads us right into our second major risk, the volatility that's hidden inside the government's expanded balance sheet. The OBR is now measuring this using public sector net financial liabilities, or PSNFL.
Right, which is a much broader and frankly more complex measure than the traditional public sector net debt we're all used to hearing about.
So what does it include?
PSNFL is essentially a more honest measure of the government's financial position. It includes all financial assets and liabilities, so things like the assets of funded public pension schemes, student loans, equity investments, all of it.
And it's grown a lot.
It's more than doubled since 2005-06. It now stands at 82.9% of GDP.
Okay, so if PSNFL is broader than the traditional debt figure, what's the difference between that and the most comprehensive measure, public sector net worth, or PSNW?
That's the crucial distinction. Think of it this way. PSNFL tracks your bank accounts, your credit cards, and your investments, your financial position. PSNW, the biggest measure, is like your total net worth. It includes your house, your land, your infrastructure.
The physical stuff.
Exactly. And the key risk we're focusing on is that PSNFL excludes the massive non-financial assets of the state, the land, the buildings, but it includes the liabilities that are sometimes related to those assets.
And that's the major vulnerability. Because PSNFL includes the valuation of these financial holdings, it exposes the whole balance sheet to these sharp, unexpected shocks. Can you detail the sensitivity analysis they ran?
The sensitivity is really striking. For example, a modest 1 percentage point drop in the discount rate they use for funded pension liabilities. That alone raises PSNFL by a huge 2.6% of GDP in the year that shock occurs.
And that's not some crazy hypothetical. That's comparable to the market dislocation we saw in 2016-17.
Precisely. Or, say, a 10% fall in equity prices still raises PSNFL by 1.4% of GDP. These aren't remote risks. They are immediate liabilities triggered by market volatility.
So the government's financial position can be materially altered overnight by external market forces, not just by policy choices.
Exactly right. And this brings us to what's called the near public sector reclassification risk. This is potentially the largest overnight spike risk. It's when bodies that are currently classified as private sector, but which provide essential public services and hold big net financial liabilities, get pulled back onto the public balance sheet, usually after some kind of government intervention or regulatory change.
And because of that PSNFL distinction we just talked about, where you only count the financial liabilities and not their physical assets.
The reclassification spikes the government's debt metrics sharply. The OBR quantified two major examples. Bringing water companies back onto the public books could increase PSNFL by $78 billion.
Which is 2.8% of GDP.
Right. And housing associations are an even bigger risk, estimated at a $99 billion or 3.5% of GDP increase. We're starting to see how blurry that line between public and private really is in the UK.
And we should probably just briefly mention the long-term contingent liabilities, the sort of promises or potential costs lurking just outside the main accounts.
A huge portfolio. totals $250 billion. The biggest single financial time bomb sitting out there is cleaning up the nuclear legacy. Costs for decommissioning are projected to crystallize at $115 billion.
But thankfully, that's largely over 30 years from now.
A problem for another day, but it's on the books.
Our third long-term structural threat is climate change. And the urgency here has never been higher. I mean, global temperatures are now 1.3 to 1.4 degrees C above pre-industrial levels.
And we're expected to exceed that critical 1.5 degrees C threshold by 2029.
It's happening fast.
It is. And when we look at the fiscal risks, the OBR has to compare the unavoidable mitigation costs, the cost of transitioning to net zero, against the economic damage costs of inaction. And the key update this year is, well, it's alarming. The estimated damage costs are now significantly higher.
Why the big jump?
It's due to the OBR using updated NGFS Phase V modeling, which is much more sophisticated. It now incorporates the economic impacts of temperature variability and precipitation, not just the average temperature rise.
So it's more realistic about the real-world effects.
Far more realistic. And then there's central below 3 degrees C scenario, which is consistent with maintaining current global policies. UK GDP is estimated to be 8% lower by the early 2070s compared to a stable climate baseline.
8% lower GDP. That's huge. That's a 3 percentage point bigger hit than last year's report estimated. What does that do to the government's balance sheet?
Well, lower productivity and a smaller tax base translates directly into a massive fiscal cost.
Yeah.
The report projects public debt would rise by 56% of GDP by the early 2070s, purely from the indirect economic effects and direct costs of that climate damage.
Now, there is a slight silver lining here. The mitigation costs, the cost of transitioning to net zero, are estimated to be slightly lower than previously thought.
That's right. Now, 21% of GDP by 2050-51, which is a 9% of GDP reduction compared to the 2021 estimates. And that reflects both lower whole economy cost estimates and some government policy decisions.
Like freezing fuel duty.
Exactly. But that policy decision on fuel duty brings us right back to these difficult trade-offs. The net zero transition still has the single largest certain fiscal cost, and it's in the form of lost tax receipts.
Right, because no one is buying petrol.
Precisely. Total lost receipts reach $43.2 billion, that's 1% of GDP, by 2050-51. And fuel duty alone accounts for half of the total transition cost. The government have to find a new revenue stream to replace that colossal sum.
So what's the worst case scenario then? If we combine the damage and the transition costs.
In that 3 degrees C scenario, the sheer magnitude of risk becomes crystal clear. The combined fiscal effects of climate damage and the transition, well, they result in public debt being a massive 108% of GDP, higher than the FRS baseline projection by the early 2070s.
108% of GDP higher.
It's a generational burden. It suggests every single policy choice we made today has a catastrophic multiplier effect decades down the line if we fail to hit our targets.
Okay, let's shift gears to the broader fiscal risk register, covering those shorter to medium-term risks. Because since the 2023 report, the threat landscape has really intensified.
It really has. 12 risks have increased in probability or severity, and 11 risks have actually crystallized but are still active, putting immediate pressure on public finances.
And these immediate risks are important because they shrink the government's capacity to deal with those huge long-term threats we just discussed.
Exactly. Two geopolitical risks that were, hypotheticals in the past have now materialized. We're seeing rising trade tensions, especially with the U.S. signaling a 10% minimum tariff on UK goods.
The so-called Liberation Day tariffs.
That's the one. And that just increases volatility in customs revenue.
Yeah.
At the same time, cyber threats are intensifying. Attacks are hitting major companies. Marks & Spencer reportedly suffered a $300 million loss.
In government departments too, right?
Yes, HMRC reported a $47 million loss.
Yeah.
And the OBR modeled what a major successful attack on critical national infrastructure would do. They estimate it could increase borrowing by 1.1% of GDP in the year of the shock alone.
Domestically, the biggest crystallized risk seems to be around welfare and long-term health. The number of people citing long-term sickness or health-related inactivity has just soared.
It's up by 660,000 since the pandemic.
And that has an immediate fiscal consequence.
It does. Correspondingly, health-related welfare onflows, the number of people moving on to those benefits, have doubled. If these high onflow levels were sustained, welfare spending would be roughly $12 billion higher than forecast by 2029-30.
That is a huge unbudgeted expenditure that needs immediate policy intervention.
It really does.
This all raises a big question. If the demands are soaring and the economic base is shrinking due to climate, Where is all the revenue coming from?
Well, the current plan relies very heavily on tax. The tax to GDP ratio is forecast to reach a historic high of 37.7% by 2027-28.
And the risk there?
The critical thing here is that this increases the government's reliance on a very small, high-net-worth taxpayer base for critical revenue streams. For example, the reforms to the non-domicile regime are expected to raise $13.1 billion at peak,
And that money comes from how many people?
from under 10,000 people. If even a fraction of those individuals decide to move abroad because of the rule changes, the government has created an enormous, concentrated revenue hole overnight. It's a classic example of achieving short-term revenue at the expense of fiscal risk. So, to summarize this entire deep dive, the long-term fiscal sustainability of the UK really hinges on actively managing this perfect fiscal storm. You've got mandated liabilities compounding through the pension system, the economic foundation is shrinking because of climate damage, and the short-term pressures from welfare and security are just eating away at the fiscal space you need to respond.
And what really stands out to me is the sheer vulnerability of that expanded balance sheet that the OBR is now tracking. The new PSNFL measure exposes the government to immediate shocks, from discount rate changes to private sector bailouts.
Forcing policymakers to try and balance necessary investment, like for net zero, with critical financial discipline. It's an incredibly fine line to walk.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to consider, and it's pulled directly from the FRS report. The government's average interest return on all of its financial assets, at 2.6%, has historically been lower than its average cost of financing, which is 3.1%.
So it's losing money on its own assets.
Essentially, yes. So given the enormous projected rise in debt due to all these long-term risks we've discussed, pensions, climate, everything, can the government afford to have its expanded multi-billion-pound asset portfolio continue to underperform its cost of capital?
In effect, losing money on its own balance sheet. That question of efficiency and asset management is going to define the next decade of fiscal policy.
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.